All right. Yeah. Hey, everybody. Welcome to a Giant Machines Lunch and Learn. We're going to talk a little bit about what is web accessibility today. So, I'm not going to be able to see anyone while I'm talking. During this talk or this lunch and learn, if you have any questions in the middle as I'm talking, feel free to raise your hands within the meeting, and I'll try to answer your question to the best of my ability. And if you want to hold off or you feel like you don't want to interrupt, we'll have some time at the end as well for you to ask your questions. So if you want, write it down, hold it off, and then we could address it later. So yeah, let's begin. So today's agenda, we're going to talk a little bit, give an intro to web accessibility, and then dive into who's shaping it, who are the decision makers, who's actually helping structure what it is. Then talk about the people who it affects, those with the disabilities. Thirdly, it's good. This is going to be a lot of the content within the talk, which are the accessibility guidelines, the things about why are we doing this, how do we do this, and go through what's out there in terms of resources. Next, we'll dive a little bit into some of the accessibility tools that are out there that you start using. And then lastly, let's close it off, just some closing thoughts around this introduction. So yeah, what is web accessibility? I want to kind of start off with a real world example and talk about Domino's Pizza. So back in 2019, pretty recently, Domino's Pizza was sued by Guillermo Robles for violations of the ADA Title III, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act. The court sided with Guillermo, and he was awarded $4,000 in damages. And the crux of his lawsuit was that he just couldn't order a pizza from Domino's with the use of a screen reader. He was on their website as well as their mobile app, and he was not able to. And that was the entire case. And you might look at $4,000 and think it's not that big. But if we look at the list of other companies that have been brought to court, including Amazon, Netflix, Nike, Blue Apron, Target, and such. Target, in particular, they were brought to court in 2008 and sued by the National Federation of the Blind. And this was a class action lawsuit. And if you know anything about class action lawsuits, they're generally larger, right? This was a $6 million settlement that Target had to settle with the National Federation of the Blind. And yeah, so it could range. It could be as small as 4,000, but it could be extremely large, and it could really be very impactful. And in terms of these lawsuits, the data is hard to get to. There's a lot of sources out there, but from everything I've seen, these types of lawsuits have been increasing every year. And financially, legally, this is one type of business impact. There's a couple others that I want to talk about that affect our clients. And we covered the first one, legal, and obviously there's legal implications which cost lots of money. There's also market implications. So a quarter of Americans, or actually over a quarter of Americans, identify as disabled or some sort of disability. And according to reports, that's nearly $500 billion in disposable income. So if you are removing specific segments of your target market, that's a lot of potential that you're kind of leaving on the table. There's reputation and brand impacts. You don't want to kind of be labeled and seen within the community that you don't care about these people, right? And it's not a good look. And then lastly, SEO. Google does take this into account for when they scrape your website and understand how it scores. Accessibility is something they do factor into, so it could hurt how visible you are on the internet. So these are all the scary facts and how it really could impact our clients and how detrimental it could really be, right? So $6 million to some people, it could be their entire business. They just close doors after that. But that's not where I want to focus today, and want to bring up a slide that we presented a couple weeks ago. And these are our giant machines values, right? You have empathy, curiosity, flexibility, and ownership. And I want to focus in on empathy and how we should be empathetic to our users. So thinking about Guillermo and thinking about our application users, all that Guillermo wanted to do was order a pizza, have some dinner, exist in the world that we kind of live in today, which is the internet, and be able to do what others around him could do. So I'd say, understand that there are implications to our clients and to businesses and such, but more about, the people that we affect, the day-to-day people, the ones that are using our applications. Oh, sorry, I forgot to change the slide. These are the core values. So that being said, want to dive into who's shaping accessibility and who are the authorities and companies that are kind of speaking out, and the ones that you should actually be using as resources. So when I initially kind of started looking into this, there's a lot of acronyms thrown out there. There's a lot, and you're not quite sure how they interrelate and who's the authority and like what you should keep in your mind. So I'm going to go in and demystify some of these. So we have Ally or A11Y. You'll see this, and this is just a short term for accessibility. It starts with an A, ends with a Y. It's got 11 letters in between. So that's the origins of Ally or Ally. We have the W3C, and this is the World Wide Web Consortium. There are the main international standards group for the World Wide Web, and they are the ones that are coming up with a lot of these guidelines to help create a more accessible internet. And they do this by having certain groups within them, and one is focused on actual web accessibility, and you'll see Y or WAI. I don't know how people pronounce it, but I call it Y. So from now on, I'm just going to say Y. Y is the Web Accessibility Initiative. They're a group within the W3C. So if you're looking at these resources, understand that they're tied together. They're essentially one and the same. Then you have WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I call it WCAG. I don't know how others pronounce it, but I call it WCAG. And we could, and they are their guidelines produced by the W3C in participation with Y. And these are the guidelines that kind of tell us what our website should be doing and what makes it accessible and the steps going towards that. And this is split up into 3 different levels. And you might have seen this around the web, where people want to strive for AA standards. And that's one of them. So there's a single A standard, a AA standard, and a AAA standard. Next, we have ARIA. So I'm sure we've seen ARIA as well. ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And this is more of the technical how. So before we understood some of the reasoning, but the ARIA will help guide web developers and engineers on how to implement this on your web page and to provide some guidance to achieve WCAG standards. And then we have POUR. I forgot to mention, in WCAG, there is multiple versions. We are currently on version 2.1, so you'll see WCAG 2. That essentially means all WCAG 2.0, 2.1, but the current standard is 2.1. And 2.2 is coming out, I believe, later this year. But understand that there's multiple. And you shouldn't really be following 1.0 anymore. Everybody's on 2.0. And one of the core principles and what shapes WCAG 2 is this acronym POUR. So they use this as a part of their guidelines to essentially split up what really makes an accessible website, having it being perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So yeah, those are some acronyms that as I go through the slides, I'm going to do pretty much all acronyms from now on, but this is the landscape that we're dealing with. So when you're kind of like looking and trying to understand what to look into, ideally, this is a resource that you can use. So I'm going to go into who does this really affect? What are the disabilities essentially? And I kind of split this up into two sections where we have, disabilities that people physically or have on their body, and then those that are more general accessibility that we should also be thinking about. So go through, we have auditory types of disabilities, people that can't hear. So, a website, if you think about a podcast website, like if you were to just have an audio file running, is that really accessible? Are you including these type of users? We have cognitive disabilities, and this really is around like people with learning disabilities and have problems in that area. Are you creating super complex systems in navigation? Are you guiding your users properly throughout the experience? You have neurological disabilities. Is your site doing weird things on the content, right? Are you flickering content in and out? Like, do you have GIFs that have high intensity imagery that are going on that potentially people would find distracting and also potentially harmful? You have those with physical disabilities. People that can't use a mouse or keyboard, they might be actually navigating through other means. They might be using a mouth and stick, which would be used to actually interact with the keyboard, but not be able to interact with a mouse. We have speech disabilities, so push to talk or other talk features, possibly those people can't use those type of features. And are you only allowing that as your primary source of means for interacting with your site? And then lastly, visual. I think this is the one that most of us think about. This is the one that comes to mind first, at least when I think about accessibility, is the visual, right? Can your users see your site? And this comes in many different levels. You have color blindness to full complete blindness. So you're dealing with potential contrast issues, or just like can they see it at all? So those are the types of disabilities that are kind of listed out, but some other general things to think about. And I would consider a disability in a sense, not physical, but or one that's on the body, but would affect user experience. So thinking about the people that may live in data restrictive areas, and what I mean by that is those that have to pay for gig of data. Are you sending gigs and gigs of data over, unnecessarily potentially, and eating up someone's data costs and costing them a lot of money? Essentially, you might be segmenting or removing those that can't afford your website, essentially, to just not use it anymore. And honestly, this is everybody, right? Everybody has a cellular data plan. If I'm going on sites that are eating large amounts of my cellular data, I might just stop using it. Situational limitations. This is categorized as those that are temporary disabilities, essentially. You might think of someone with a broken arm will temporarily not be able to use your site because they can't use it. They don't have the mouse anymore. Those that are in areas where they can't speak or they can't use volume. What if they're in somewhere, you gotta be hush hush and you can't have volume, and you don't have headphones and stuff like that. So people in situational areas. Those that have slow internet. Again, this goes back to data. If you're sending over gigs and people are on their mobile and have not reliable service, they just can't use your site. And there are reports that I think about a quarter million of Americans are still on dial-up. So we're all privileged to have very fast internet, but those that are still on slow internet, as our applications grow, this is a real concern that they just can't use your site. And then lastly, those with small screens. So before we had our CRT monitors, our 640 by 480 screens and such, but as as time has evolved, we're working with much more different sizes these days, and everything's becoming smaller, right? Is your interface responsive to mobile? For your phone? Are you adjusting towards landscape? Are you adjusting towards portrait? And if your site potentially is able to even be viewed on a watch, these are all things to think about in terms of screen sizes. So yeah, I talked a little bit about who is affecting, who's shaping it, what to think about our users, and who's trying to help them. So and how do we help them? Or from some of these guidelines, and these guidelines are being produced by W3C, and there's many levels of it, and there's a lot of detail within it. So I'm gonna start stepping through some of these guidelines. So the first one is the authoring tool accessibility guidelines. So this is a lot, these are guides for authors of web content. So not necessarily web developers, but it also is for designers, product managers, content creators, just anyone trying to author content, right? This is less about the how, but possibly about the wording. There are methods that people suggest on to start in terms of language a little bit lighter in the beginning, and then you could dive a little bit heavier as you go more into the detail of your content and stuff like that. So guidelines and practices around authoring. Next, we have user agent accessibility guidelines. We are not very involved in this. This is more around how browser extensions, media players, other readers, like book readers and such, should create their applications, what we use essentially to put our view on top of how they should be following certain guidelines to make a more accessible website. And then lastly, what we're really going to focus here today is the WCAG, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, specifically version 2. And this is pretty much how we deliver our information to our users, to our consumers of our website. Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit more about that now. Earlier, I mentioned poor, and poor being perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. These guidelines are split into there's 13 guidelines, and they're split amongst these four acronyms, or at least four sections or categories. So, under perceivable, there are guidelines around text alternatives, around time-based media, adaptable, distinguishable. So trying to understand WCAG, it's really trying to understand these 13 guidelines and how they relate to poor. And talk about one of them specifically. So I mentioned time-based media in the other one. I'll go back real quick. In perceivable as the second bullet. So time-based media. Each of these guidelines are now split into the three standards: A, AA, and AAA. And in order to be AA, you must fulfill all of single A. And in order to be AAA, you must fill all of AA and single A, as well as all of AAA. So it kind of builds on top of one another. And each level just becomes a little bit more difficult or more granular in terms of what to implement. So if we take a look at captions, so captions being the second bullet for pre-recorded media. Yeah, you have captions for your pre-recorded media. Next, you could go into one level above that, which I would say is audio descriptions for your pre-recorded media. And this is narration added to your soundtrack that describes visual importance that is happening within a visual medium. And then one level above that is for pre-recorded media, I would say, is sign language. And do you have sign language associated with your pre-recorded media? So you can see the level of, I guess, difficulty or what else is being thought about as we get higher and higher in terms of the standards. A lot of people strive for AA. I believe that's pretty much what we should be striving for as well, but we should not discount AAA and depending on our users, be striving towards that as well. Oh, jump one too far. So though these guidelines are around what we should be looking for and around really the user experience and what people should be expecting. Why ARIA, or ARIA for short, is the how, right? This is where us as those that are here that are engineers and web developers, this is the more of the how it should be done and what guidance can I expect and what resources are out there to help me implement these things. Because with just the native DOM, with the native web browser, you have elements like divs, paragraphs, articles for more for newer semantic ones, new landmarks and such. But not everything could be captured with just those. So ARIA is providing additional guidance for newer design concepts that are out there. And it follows two guiding principles. And I'll be repeating specifically the first one, not a lot, but sometimes throughout this talk, is that a role is a promise. And what that really means is when you declare an element as a specific role, it comes with a promise to our user that it's going to behave like what you're saying, because that's what screen readers and other assistive tools expect. So if you are declaring a div to be a button, then you should be fulfilling the promise of this div is going to interact and behave exactly like a button in terms of keyboard interaction, in terms of how it operates, in terms of all the things. So think about what you're promising to your user as you construct your DOM and website. And then second, we have ARIA can be a cloak and enhancement. This allows for a lot of power, but also a lot of danger. So what cloaking means is that with ARIA, you could essentially override the original semantics of your elements. So let's say I have a button, and I then decide to say, no, it's actually a div, or not a div because that's not a real world. Let's just say it's a paragraph or something, and then it loses all of its context to a screen reader. The screen reader is going to go, it's not going to understand it's actually an interactable element on the page. It's going to think it's just content, right? And this is something you may want, but also if you're misusing ARIA, this can be very dangerous, right? So if you're misusing it and misaligning these ARIA rules together, you could be creating actually a more inaccessible or a less accessible experience to your users if you're not understanding how these elements relate to one another. And that is why no ARIA is better than bad ARIA. Bad ARIA, you could be just totally misguiding your users and the people that are using these technologies and leading them astray. So how to, right? So how do we actually do this? Like, what is ARIA? And I'm sure a lot of people have thought about ARIA and seen it on their web pages, like ARIA label, ARIA labeled by, or ARIA described by, and stuff like that. And those are the actual short nitty-gritty elements on the DOM, or attributes on the DOM. But ARIA actually provides a authoring practice guide, an APG. And what this really has is it's a guide that describes applying these accessible semantics to common design patterns, right? It provides examples as well as in-depth guidance for how to functionally implement them. That's one huge part of the APG. And the second part is also the fundamental practices for creating, for using and creating new accessible experiences. Not everything is a documented design pattern. There's a lot of people that are coming up with new ways to communicate information, and it's not possible to have listed everything ever made here, right? So this is just some guidance on common ones, as well as good practices if you're developing new ones. So I want to give an example of what the common design pattern is, because we'll go into a little exercise after this in terms of trying to think of what are these 30 design patterns. But if you think about a select dropdown, right? I feel like a lot of people have been asked or tasked with, hey, can you, we have this custom select dropdown. Can you now go implement it for me? And you're thinking, great, let me go look, and a select is like, oh, you can't actually style select dropdown. There's a lot of challenges around select dropdowns. I'm going to go create my own. And then you start creating your own and think about the how you interact with it as a developer. And that's potentially how you implement it. But then you are potentially not thinking about what are the standards or what concepts and patterns are already out there that are being leveraged by some of these assistive technologies. So what you're actually looking at when you're developing a custom dropdown, you're looking at either a combo box or a list box. So these are two design patterns listed in the APG, and this is depending on the features in terms of like type ahead and all these other little things, like a select dropdown, there's no typing ahead and stuff. So it's a list box, but if you want type ahead and such, it's a combo box. Anyway, a lot of details around this, but essentially what you're making is a combo box or list box. And the APG helps define the relationships for and semantics between elements. So, when you click on your target, what is that? Is it a button? Is it an input? What element is it? What should it be? And also, what is its relationship to the drop-down menu that pops up? So thinking about and listing about all these elements that kind of create this experience for your user. Next is the interactions, the keyboard interactions. How should it interact? As you work with a custom select, as you work with a select dropdown, you press the arrow button, you can navigate through that. But what are the exact rules and how will screen readers expect this? Because you're creating a promise to your user that it's going to provide a certain experience. And then things like focus tracking, how focus should be shifted as you interact with it. And then also the various states. Combo boxes should be able to be disabled. They should also potentially have disabled options. How do you communicate this and what are the various states that kind of go into this? So there's a lot here. So, when we're developing bespoke components, think about, do you really want to take on the task of fulfilling all these promises to your user, or potentially what's out there? If you've been on a project with me, whenever I deal with a custom dropdown, I always go to Downshift.js. That's my go-to for filling all these accessibility use cases, because that was the goal of the library, and it does it in a way where I could completely style the experience the way I want, however, still fulfill all the user experience in terms of accessibility. So yeah, the APG got 30 patterns. So I'm gonna kind of just open it up and give everybody 2 minutes to possibly think about other design patterns that people think would kind of belong here, right? So I mentioned select, there's buttons, there's links and all that, but there's a lot. So I'm gonna kind of just pause for like 2 minutes and feel free to type in chat and see what people come up with. And it's not necessarily, you're not gonna come up, you might come up with things that aren't on the list, and that's okay. Because like I said, these are just common patterns, but it doesn't mean that it isn't a pattern and it shouldn't have a user experience tied to it. So yeah, just go start the timer, 2 minutes, type in chat, see what other people say, and see what you could come up with. So I see media controls, table views, filters, forms, tabs, yeah. more drop downs. Everything's a drop down. Everything's a search word input. Yeah, shopping cart. I would say shopping cart's probably like something that you would split up into multiple different concepts, possibly. It's probably composed of many APG design components or patterns. Navigation, hammer to menus, yeah. All right, so we have a couple good ones here, and those that are, some of these are actually on the actual the 30 guidelines. So here's the 30. So accordions, right? We don't have native. We just saw toast notifications come up. Toast notifications is the second one. Alert and the third one. Alerts, alert message dialogues, right? So if you're visually impaired, thinking about an alert, something pops up on your screen. How does a person with visual impairment ever even know that came up, right? Yeah, I'll tell you right now, there's an ARIA rule called, or not rule, attribute called ARIA live. And if you declare something as ARIA live, it'll actually announce it to a user if something pops up. And there's different modes where it's like polite versus aggressive, where if you have aggressive, it'll just interrupt whatever is happening and it'll just say it. But polite will actually wait until the screen reader has a pause and then says it afterwards. But yeah, toast notifications, that would fall under alerts. Yeah, so a lot of these are kind of what builds our website aside from what's natively given to us by the DOM. See, interesting ones like feed. That's probably a newer concept nowadays with like infinite scrolling and how does users interact with that type of medium or chat messages and stuff like that. So yeah. I would leverage the APG whenever I think about these things. So understand that if you're tasked with creating a custom checkbox and such, this is a great tool to understand what you really should be covering. And also they provide examples. So it's great. And for those that kind of had put examples or have examples listed out themselves that kind of don't fit any of these molds, I'd say inspect the DOM of where you kind of came up with that idea, right? If you like, one of the things I thought about when I look at like the New York Times, and a common way of conveying information is like a tile, essentially. A tile is not here, but what does a tile mean to a user, and how does one interact with like that kind of article in a sense? So looking around the internet, understand what other people are doing in terms of creating these experiences and potentially leveraging it for yourself. And here is the practices that help guide you if you are creating new experiences. So a better understanding of what landmark regions are and how to use them within your web page. How you should be providing more descriptive names and descriptions and what should be described. Keyboard interfaces. I saw someone post table views and such. Yep, table is an interesting way of portraying information to a user. So, how do assistive technologies, and if you're trying to do something interesting with the table or grid, how would you do it well? Communicating values and limits for ranges. Structural roles in terms of what roles and semantics should be put on a page. And then lastly, hiding semantics, when you should be hiding. I said this before, this is dangerous. You could hide and overwrite things, but when you should be doing it and what's the best ways of doing it. So I came up with a little example to show usage or how you might use the APG in terms of creating more custom. Oh, sorry, I keep forgetting to move slides. Here are the patterns, practices. But yeah, so in terms of, I'll leave the slide on for a little bit longer so people actually could digest it a little bit. But yeah, so I created a dialogue. So dialogue was one of the patterns before, and I kind of just did it from a visuals perspective in terms of what I imagine a dialogue to be visually. So, to me, this is a dialogue. Here's the code that rendered it. Essentially, it's a div and another div that contains the white box, and then a close button, and then some content in it. Right? Visually, this to me looks like a dialogue. This is completely a dialogue. However, to screen readers, they don't know this is a dialogue. So I ran Google Lighthouse on this page when this dialogue was up, and it passes everything. It doesn't know that you've promised or are trying to convey to a user that this is a dialogue conceptually. So it doesn't know that there's anything wrong in terms of accessibility with this. So tools are great, but it's not going to get you all the way. So here's a better implementation. It's probably a little small to some of you, so I'll describe kind of what's happening here. But following the APG, you could start, essentially it's a testing guide or a spec guide. You start, implementing the features that should be there. Like when a user were to open this dialog, they had to click a button. When you click a button and something pops up, the focus of your cursor is still on that button. So someone that is using assistive technologies, they don't know that something just popped up in their face and their focus should be shifted. So here I'm purposely focusing the content element and also giving a label to it so they understand that my focus has now shifted. The ARIA label is dialogue example. It is a modal, and giving a little bit more information, as well as the role of dialogue, which has some promises to it. Which one of those promises is if you press escape on a mobile dialogue, that it should close. In my previous example, pressing escape, I didn't think about it, and it's not there. There's other things that kind of don't relate to dialogues in particular, like the button with an X as the screen reader that goes to it. What does that even mean? What is, maybe you're using an SVG to portray an X, and they don't know what that is. So giving it an ARIA label and telling people that this is to close the modal, and things like that. So you could use these the APG, and if you find these common patterns, to help enhance and give you a better experience for your users, even though the tools are saying you're 100% accessible. It doesn't know contextually what you're trying to portray. So I'll admit this doesn't fulfill all. Don't think it's this simple. This does not fulfill everything. There is a lot more to a dialogue, but these hit on specific points. So in terms of what it's missing is it's missing focus trapping, where they're in the dialogue and you want to keep your user within the dialogue and not be able to navigate outside of it, which would create a confusing navigation system. You would want to, and there's a bunch of other things. So you could follow these specs, but also try to leverage what's out there potentially. So if you another plug to one of my more used libraries is React Modal. So React Modal's its first line in its README is creating an accessible dialogue or modal. So that's the goal of the project, is to follow this spec and give a accessible experience. And then from that, since these are more geared towards accessibility and trying to follow the spec, a lot of these libraries that are focused on it don't actually focus on styling. So you're kind of free to style it the way you want, and it's not really fighting design systems and themes and such. So it allows that bespokeness. So yeah, that's the APG. Extremely useful tool, extremely useful guides. Definitely take a look at it. Next, kind of want to talk around what tools are out there that you start using today to help identify as well as test your components that you're now creating from the APG and trying to follow WCAG2 standards and such. So in terms of from the developer's point of view, there's Axe DevTools. So Axe DevTools is a Chrome extension that you could run on your site, and it'll call out some inaccessible elements and such. So if you're improperly using ARIA, this is a great tool that will call you out on it. If you're missing things or just not using it properly, stuff like that. Like I said before, it doesn't know intent. So the dialogue that I created first one would pass Axe DevTools because it doesn't know it's a dialogue. Then you have Axe Core. Axe Core is an NPM package. You can add this to your front-end applications. And there's utilities around Axe Core that actually allows you to run it with Jest and add it to your test suite. So you could just add Axe Core, run the output that would normally output on your Chrome extension, because all it is really looking at is the DOM itself and understanding whether you are using your labels correctly, ARIA labels correctly, or your ARIA attributes correctly. So it's a good testing tool. Chrome DevTools, they've added more and more pretty much every year in terms of accessibility. They have an accessibility panel specifically to understand what you're doing on your page and what's there. They also have the accessibility tree, which is how screen readers kind of navigate your site. And they also have contrast tools to help you better understand whether or not you're passing that requirement. Besides the dev tools, there's a less deep dive one. There's the Chrome Lighthouse. So Chrome Lighthouse essentially gives you a score on how accessible your site is. Particular for accessibility underneath, it actually, I believe, uses Axe DevTools. I could be wrong. I don't know if they've changed it, but back a year or two ago, they were using pretty much Axe DevTools underneath. And then ESLint plugin, JSX Ally. We do a lot of React projects. We use JSX a lot. This is another tool to help you know whether you're using ARIA labels correctly, or if you're assigning roles to specific elements that it comes with certain promises, and helps you call out. It helps a little bit, but it doesn't cover everything, right? So like I said before, dialogue, that example, it doesn't know intent. So a lot of this a lot of this talk is just around education. And then we have our users. So these are some screen readers. I know most of us are on Mac. So there's Mac VoiceOver that comes installed already on your machine. So you can play around with it already and use it as you're developing and working through your UIs. But in terms of Windows, I believe you have to download and install. There's NVDA, I believe that's free. And then there's also JAWS. I would say those two are probably the two major players in this space. JAWS, I don't know if they have a free version, but I would say if you're on a Windows, look for NVDA first. If it doesn't fulfill your needs, start looking at JAWS or some other one. And then Linux, I'll admit, I don't know too much around the Linux. As I was kind of looking through some of this stuff, Akra was the first and most prominent one that came up. So there are screen readers for Linux. You might have to do a little bit more investigation, but know that those tools are out there. And lastly, some closing thoughts. So in terms of making a more accessible web, I don't think people are purposely doing this. No one is purposely making things inaccessible. No one is, at least I don't think so. At least I hope not. No one's malicious about this. This is more around just knowledge, educating, and advocacy. We're trying to create user experiences, and we're trying to be inclusive and being empathetic to our users. So how do we do this? Just the more you know, the better. And hopefully this talk really gave you some tools and resources and giving you a better understanding of the landscape and who you could look to for that guidance as you're creating your components, right? So the next time you look at a design, I'd say think about what established design systems are already out there, because you don't have to recreate these systems yourself. You could leverage these examples, leverage these guides, leverage this thought that has already been put into it. And then if it's not in the APG, look for examples where that inspiration came from in terms of that design potentially. See if the designs kind of came from another site in terms of these GUIs or UIs that people created, and see what those sites are doing in terms of accessibility and how they're addressing it. Run a screen reader on it. There's a lot of ways we could better improve based on what's already out there, and also just like what others have already done. And then lastly, yeah, the tools out there, I would say start exploring them, start trying to put them into your workflow. You could kind of see already what's to come. We're gonna talk a little bit more about them in a future session. And our goals are to have a little bit more hands-on sessions with ARIA in general, and working with the APG and seeing how you could kind of fold this into the way you work. Sessions on screen readers, tips and tricks, how to use them. I'll admit, when I first used it, it's very jarring. It's almost like a person kind of always interrupting you, but it's a useful tool. And once you get the hang of the navigation, it's actually really cool. And then lastly, a design perspective. How does designers think about accessibility? What are they accounting for, and how they approach accessibility? So yeah, I hope this was useful in terms of information and what to look into and what to start reading. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Hoan. Really appreciate your time putting this together. For everyone who is here and has been a part of this talk, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for spending this afternoon with us. I have one request, which is take a brief moment and just let us know what you think. What was useful? What would you like to see done differently if we were to rerun this session in the future, or other similar things? Any feedback you can give us is really, really helpful in building up this practice of lunch and learns that we're building here at Giant Machine. So thank you so much. I know that also at this time, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.